Hello and welcome to the Shindig, a podcast about archaeology presented to you by the Red River Archaeology Group. I'm Dr. Tom Horne, your presenter, and I'm here with our ace producer, Luke Barry.
Hello.
In the previous episode, we talked to Dr. Ryan K. McNutt about the Camp Lawton Archaeological Project. We were looking really at the background into how that Confederate prisoner of war camp came to be, and we just started talking about conditions at the camp in terms of food and drink at the end of episode 1. In episode 2, we look at that again, and we're really beginning to look at the flip side of that. If you're malnourished, what the effect that will be on your body. So we're looking more at disease and death at the camp. And then we look at what happens in terms of the chronology of the site when the Union Army starts to threaten and the site has to be abandoned. And Ryan also then goes into the work that they're doing, the project at the moment. Really interesting outreach, really interesting finds to do, particularly with the African American enslaved community around about the camp. So we hope you really enjoy this episode. It was really fascinating to make.
Yeah, it's an incredible interview. We're so happy that we have it, and we hope that you enjoy listening to it as much as we enjoyed recording it. So here it is, part 2 of the interview with Dr. Ryan K. McNutt.
Okay, Ryan. So they could supplement their meals, as we discussed, by buying it at hugely inflated prices from the prison guards. Could they, for example, was there any rabbits or wildlife? What was the sort of flora and fauna around them?
The flora and fauna is interesting. Again, remember, these are immigrants, people from northern states. This is, for many of them, their first experience of the wildlife and the flora and fauna of the South. So sometimes it's difficult to kind of get out what they're actually talking about. There's probably some hyperbole. There's references to mosquitos the size of hummingbirds, which they certainly at times seem to be that big, but that's probably hyperbole. They talk about tarantulas. That, interestingly enough, probably isn't, because Georgia does have 2 relatively large species of spiders. There is a fishing spider whose body is about 3 inches in size, and we also have...
That sounds ghastly. Ghastly. I'm sorry. Go on.
There are also Carolina, there's wolf spiders, and one of the species of those, Carolina spider, its body gets up to about 2 inches in size. So 2.5, yeah, pretty big, 4 or 5 centimeters, something like that. I'm probably slightly off on the conversion. It's probably bigger than that. But I actually have a picture, because those are still on the site, still on our social media. There's a picture of one that we saw a few days ago that is probably about as big as my hand. And it certainly looks like a tarantula. There also were alligators present. There's one mention from Ransom about POWs killing an alligator at the lower end of the stream. He doesn't say if they ate it or not. It might be somewhat tough to skin, but I imagine if you're hungry enough, you probably found a way. And we still have those present on site. Our current excavation site is on the north bank of the stream, and it seems to be home to 2 resident gators. A fairly small one that's probably about 4 to 5 feet in length, that I'm calling Gus, and then another one that's probably something like 8 to 12 feet in length, that I've taken to calling Boots, because he'd probably make a pretty nice pair of boots. So yeah, there's lots of stuff like that present. They also talk about basically eating rodents. There's a reference to them drowning out a gopher and then eating a gopher, probably a pocket gopher. I've talked to our zooarchaeologist, and he's not quite sure what they might be referring to, because there's some debate about kind of how early gophers show up in Georgia, but some kind of small ground-dwelling rodent or mammal they were eating. There's also turtles. We did find some pieces of turtle shell and turtle bone that might be from a preserved context. That might indicate they were getting some turtles from the stream, which are probably relatively easy to catch if you're fast enough. And there is a reference from a POW of almost stepping on a snake when he's walking to the stream, and talks about how somebody yells snake, and then immediately two POWs pounce on it and beat it with sticks, and then fix it to a tree and skin it. And he says it's something like 6 feet long, something like that, 6 foot long black snake. What species it is kind of tough to say. It could be an indigo snake, or it could just be a big water snake. It's not clear if it was venomous or not. But we do
I just
have,
looked in horror at producer Luke there when the idea of people running up to the snake and beating it to death and then skinning it and eating it. I mean, but it kind of it gives you an impression of just how desperate people were. And I think that this idea that malnutrition is probably their number one thing that they're concerned about, over and above being shot by the camp guards. But that speaks to a bigger truth, isn't it? That isn't it true that many or most casualties on both sides during the US Civil War and many wars was due to disease and malnutrition and exposure to the elements? Is that the correct picture? That's a real killer. It's disease and malnutrition that are killing people.
Yeah, disease, malnutrition,
and exposure as well, because we've got this winter coming in as well. We always get to remember this horrible winter is occurring.
Exposure and psychological aspects as well. Disease at Camp Lawton, it does seem to be better than at Andersonville. They have, for one thing, they have access to fresh water. That certainly seems to help. But you still have these lingering issues of scurvy. You also have issues of gangrene and blood poisoning. You're living in a dirty environment. And there are accounts at both Andersonville and Lawton of kind of recurring issues with gangrene. They have things where there's also smallpox epidemics that break out. Interestingly enough, the Confederacy does try to stop that by vaccinating for smallpox. But the problem is the way that you vaccinated in the 19th century for smallpox was you cut a slit in the arm and you put the live smallpox virus in. Which,
right, yeah,
it works, but you're also cutting an arm open in an environment that is full of disease and bacteria, and that often led to blood poisoning and gangrene to such an extent that one of the conspiracy theories, interestingly enough, among POWs, was that the vaccination campaign was really an attempt to try to kill as many of them as possible, but they weren't actually being vaccinated, that they were intentionally being poisoned by the Confederate doctors.
It doesn't, if they're prone to scurvy, doesn't scurvy stop wounds from healing and open up old wounds? Isn't the one of the particularly ghastly aspects of it?
Absolutely, yeah. There are guys that are talking about the skin over their knees bursting open, just because of lack of vitamin C intersecting with the immune system and skin resilience and development. Not that kind of doctor, but yeah, it's a host of ongoing problems that link directly to scurvy. And again, I mean, you could get sweet potatoes to offset it. There's a sutler's cabin, which is what we're looking for this spring, that was inside the stockade. It was run by a person appointed by the Confederate commandant, and they would bring in supplies and sell them to prisoners. But again, the problem of money. Most of these guys are what were known as salted cod. Some of them have been in the prison system since 61, 62. Their clothes are falling off. Any money that they came in with that they managed to keep, they've already spent. There are some people that come in later that are fine. There's a host of recently captured POWs coming in from places like Sherman's army, battles in North Carolina, that are still perfectly kitted out, and they still have their pay bonuses that they got. So they seem to do much better at surviving because they've got money to spend. And interestingly enough, there is an somewhat operating postal system where we have letters from POWs that they're sending their families back north, asking them to send them money, $5 in greenbacks, or, send me $20 if you can spare it. And they're then using that money in the system. And archaeological research supports this, where the initial work inside the stockade found quite a bit of coinage, some foreign coinage too, from Austria and from Buenos Aires. So there is stuff circulating inside prison, but it does very much seem to be a case of your survivability is tied on how lucky you are to have money and how lucky you are to have people who are willing to send you money. And if you don't have that, yeah, disease, scurvy, and more what seems to be one of the killers as well that is tied to exposure is PTSD. There are numerous accounts of essentially men just becoming, as they call it, maudlin and just staring off in the distance, and they almost literally just waste away. They go down the stream and kind of like dig themselves into the earth, and then they're found dead the next morning from exposure, where it doesn't seem like it's intentional suicide, but there are definitely tons of psychological aspects that are affecting survivability. And this is probably not necessarily PTSD coming from inside the camp, but ongoing PTSD from being exposed to what's really one of the first industrial wars. I mean, there are horror stories of artillery and rifle fire and the effect that it has on men and bodies. There's one good account of a rebel Confederate artillery shell that lands in a caisson full of ammunition of a Union battery, and the entire gun emplacement explodes and goes up. And the eyewitness talks about it just being a red mist with ribbons of flesh, and he's probably 40 or 50 meters away from it. But then a few seconds later, the body of one of the artillerymen who is in the blast lands next to him, and his legs have been blown off. His chest is open enough to see his heart inside of it. His eyes are burned away. His ears are gone. He has what seemed like probably third-degree burns over most of his body, and he's still alive because he's begging the eyewitness to kill him and put it into it.
I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about the horrors of war, I mean, and what these people have gone through even before they're in this horrendous POW system is, and that's something I wouldn't have really, I mean, you consider it, but it's just kind of like, it's when we were discussing, give me the lead up to, why this camp's being built, Ryan, and it's quite easy. And I think I did it, guilty of it, certainly, was that, I sort of glossed over that. And you forget that these people have got, huge issues with their mental health, even if they were relatively healthy mentally beforehand. And does that come out in any of the letters as well? They talk about their struggles?
They don't talk about it in their letters. There's very much this, I'm okay, send me stuff. Like, they don't seem to want to put that in the home front. And they don't talk about it on a personal level, but they do talk about other POWs. And they talk about, for example, men waking up screaming in the middle of the night, men that are just walking around mumbling to themselves. And this is probably PTSD. And it's probably some of the reasons why some of this is really impactful inside the stockade is because it seems like it's possible to kind of push it aside when you're in combat, when you're moving, when you're, you have direction, you have orders, you're with a squad of men, you have tasks, there are things that are filling up your day, but then you're suddenly inside a stockade, and the only thing that marks out your days is getting rations and trying to stay alive. And that probably intersects with one of the other big aspects that comes out of prison is prisoners keeping themselves busy with either trying to escape through tunnels or escape at other means. There's definitely escape tunnels that were attempted at Camp Lawton. None of them were successful. They were all found and filled in. Our craft work, making items. One of my favorite pieces from Dr. Green, who's director before me, who did some excavations on one of these brick ovens. And inside that brick oven is a little chess piece, a palm that's been carved out of burnt wood for the black pieces, and presumably they use natural wood for the white side. But it's very much this idea of keeping yourself busy, because if you don't have anything to occupy yourself, you just all that PTSD, all that trauma seems to just surge up, and there's no psychological help for it. There is some access to things like alcohol and tobacco, but it's harder to get. And both of those outside prisoner contexts were used as treatments for kind of anxiety, combat fatigue, much in the same way that they were in World War II and in wars since. It's probably part of the reason why Grant smoked so heavily. There's a famous quote from one of his aides that says that, Grant was calm everywhere, but then Grant also smoked everywhere.
So they're all, when they can, they're self-medicating and obviously making their health worse. But you get in that cycle of you feel bad, and then you self-medicate more, and so any money they have, they're kind of making themselves feel worse, but just to get through that hour or that day. But I mean, and that's the thing. We think of this in the way you've described it so beautifully, and this tragic situation is that you seem like they're there for months or years, but they're only in Camp Lawton between, is it October 10th and November the 22nd, 1864. And why is that? You mentioned General Sherman's, as I think you explained a wee bit about what the March to the Sea was, and the panic that happens even in as far south as Georgia, and obviously that this has a knock-on effect to Camp Lawton and what the prison commanders decide to do.
So Sherman has taken Atlanta. Everybody is up in the air about what he's going to actually do. His Confederate opponent hightails it out of Georgia, heading towards eventually Nashville, and he expects Sherman is going to follow him. Sherman doesn't. He moves out of Atlanta and is heading south into the interior of Georgia. And at first, they're kind of not quite sure where he's going. And this is part of the reason why men are shifted from Andersonville, too. They think that he's making for Andersonville. So they move everybody from Andersonville into Lawton. And around about kind of fairly late in the day, in terms of the campaign, kind of November 15th, 16th, that kind of middle part of November, it becomes pretty clear that he's in fact heading probably for Savannah and probably right for Lawton. So they evacuate Lawton. All the POWs, the guards clearly know that this is going on for several days in advance. But the POWs are basically woken up the night of the 22nd by drum rolls, signal fires, and they're kind of rousted out all of their tents and all their shelters, and they're lined up and they're marched out to the railhead. And they're shipped from there to Savannah initially, and then from Savannah, they're either shipped to Florence Stockade in South Carolina, another one of these kind of camps just like Lawton, or some of them are shipped south to Blackshear, Georgia, where one of my grad students did a really nice project looking at the evidence for that. And they're just kind of shunned around. The ones from Blackshear go to another temporary camp in Thomasville, Georgia. And some of those guys actually end up walking back into Andersonville on Christmas Eve, 1864. And it's still running, it's still in shape. And they talk about you can almost feel a kind of misery and depression rolling off the page. They talk about it being Christmas Eve and walking back into gates that they thought they'd seen the end of.
It's a real waking nightmare. And I mean, the conditions these guys would have been being moved around in, I imagine, utterly horrendous. Obviously, the weather's getting worse. And it puts to mind almost the sort of death marches that you get in the closing stages of the Second World War. Were they as horrendous as I can imagine they were?
It seems like it. There's open box cars. They're exposed to elements. They talk about it being a freezing rain on the 22nd. There's references to just POWs that are frozen solid that die on the train, that get offloaded and buried. It seems like they also have, again, low rations. And this is one instance where it does seem like the guards are equally affected, because there's mentions of guards and POWs here and there sharing rations, cooling stuff because none of them seem to have enough. This is kind of pure Confederacy and command structure in full panic mode. And again, clothing wise, if they're lucky, they've got trousers, a blouse, maybe a coat. Those seem to be in short supply, and clothing is in such short supply inside the stockade that they're going down to the kind of triage area where the dead are carried to a corner of the stockade so that the Confederates can come in and collect them up and rebury them or bury them outside the stockade, and they're taking coats off the dead, clothing off the dead.
And do you find, I mean, I think part of your excellent social media sites, you do find buttons, don't you, from clothing, so obviously, what people are wearing just through that sort of circumstantial evidence?
Yeah, we've got quite a lot of, there's an interesting story that's in the buttons. You get general service Eagle buttons, and those are enlisted issue. They come in different sizes. You've got coat size and cuff size, so you can kind of work out if they're coming off a sack coat. Shirts weren't military issue. They were just whatever you could get or bring, and they tend to have kind of glass prosser buttons. So there's kind of pretty good indications of shirts and different type of clothing. Federal issue trousers had 4-hole iron buttons, and we found several of those. We've also found several adjustment buckles for the waistband of those trousers. So you can see that those are there, but you can also see kind of some of the decay where stuff is falling off these clothing. Buttons are interesting because quite a lot of the Confederate guards had almost a collector's mania for buttons. So you could trade buttons for tobacco and things for guards. They would trade for peppers, vegetables, rations. So buttons became kind of somewhat of a currency, which is interesting. And the buttons also tell a story of some of the men that are in the camp. One of the interesting things that we have is Camp Lawton is supposed to be just for enlisted men. There's another POW camp in Macon, Georgia that is supposed to be for the officers. But we have, we know that there were a few lieutenants that were in Camp Lawton, but we also have buttons that have the General Service Eagle button is, basically it looks like a U.S. Eagle. It's got a shield on the breast. The one for enlisted just has stripes in the shield, but the one for officers has a solid I for infantry, a C if you were cavalry, A for artillery. So it's got a letter inside of that, and that's for identifying officers in a battlefield context. And those are captains, majors, company grade officers. We also have some cuff buttons that look like they are from field grade officers, or not field grade, staff officers, general staff officers. Those have a different shape. They've got stars around the rim of the button. And that's interesting because none of those guys are really supposed to be in law. They're supposed to be in Macon in the officers' camp. So there's interesting stories behind that.
And that's really my the point is, because I mean, I think listeners might be thinking they're only there for just over a month. Archaeologically, you're getting buttons. What else are you finding? You can imagine the stockade. What are you finding? What you expect to find, and what you kind of looking for in the future? What questions you need to ask, and what are you hoping to find?
What we're looking for in the future is that there's actually been really, and this is one of the great things about Camp Lawton, is it is a time capsule. It is very much this kind of stuff.
It's a moment in time. It is one of these moments. Yeah. Very rare in archaeology.
And it's fascinating because, as far as we're aware, none of the land was ever really used for anything other than light farming and timber. There is CCC activity there, Civilian Conservation Corps, when it gets turned into a state park and a fish hatchery. So that has impacted some of it, but it's not this kind of massive development that has really impacted the site. So we've got really good preservation that tells us about foodways, the POWs, and we barely scratched the surface actually inside the stockade. There's been a couple of seasons of excavation inside the stockade. It picked up evidence of dense POW occupation, of currency, medicinal aspect, dietary aspects, but it's very much just the kind of first initial brush in what essentially was a pretty small scale area. And the question,
but you're doing a lot with it, though, aren't you? Because I've seen again on your social media, you're doing a great line in 3D scanning and printing, so you're using a lot of technology.
Yeah, so we're bringing all that out. A big part of our Camp Lawton is public archaeology, so that 3D scanning and 3D printing of those objects that we've got help with that. There's a lot of those objects that really tell a story. One of my favorite ones is an improvised pipe, where it's a kaolin clay pipe, manufactured in Glasgow, actually, by Davidson's of Glasgow. And the bowl of the pipe has broken off. So what somebody's done is they've taken a mini ball, a lead rifle bullet, and they've heated it up to be soft enough to where they can mold it into a little bowl around the stem so they can keep smoking their pipe. And you can actually feel, even in the 3D scan, is high enough quality to where you can feel the teeth groove from that individual POW's tooth where he gripped it in his mouth. And that kind of really drives home that human element, but also that need to self-medicate, and probably also that need to, I mean, tobacco is an appetite suppressant. So in a situation where you don't have a lot of food, probably the more you smoke, the less you want food. And our kind of goal for the rest of the project is answer some of those questions like I mentioned. Look at ethnicity in the stockade, look at resistance in the stockade. How are they dealing with this being essentially under the thumb of this kind of all-seeing eye of Confederate authority that can see almost all their activity in the stockade? How do you deal with that to do things that you're not necessarily allowed to do? Alcohol is supposed to be prohibited, but we know they're getting alcohol from some limited samples. That's what part of this field school at Georgia Southern is focused on this spring. Is I've got a grad student who is really interested in anthropology and archaeology of shadow economies, of these kind of hidden economies that happen where they're not supposed to be. And that's one of the reasons why we're looking for the Sutler's Cabin, because that will probably be one of those kind of nodes of economic activity. It's one of the few ways for stuff to kind of come into the camp. And you can imagine with that kind of outpouring of materials that then can set up a pretty good kind of nexus of shadow trading, trading illicit items that they're not supposed to have. Alcohol, medicine is restricted, tobacco as well. And this kind of thriving black market trade that is necessary for survival, but is also part of a way that POWs can resist this kind of Confederate authority, a way to kind of avoid that PTSD maudlin aspect, because at least on some level they feel like they're taking action. They're giving it back to the guards or giving it back to Confederacy by doing something they're not supposed to do inside the stockade. So that's part of our research interest coming up. We're also interested in the African American presence at Camp Lawton, which is almost no evidence outside of historical sources. We know that there were probably about 500 slaves impressed to build it. We also know that African Americans worked as teamsters running wagons for the stockade. POWs mentioned them being the ones that are bringing the rations in. The Confederate officers seem to have had enslaved servants that were, well, taking care of their officer things and keeping them in the style they were accustomed to. But archaeologically, those have largely been absent. We may have gotten a little piece of it in field work that we did in 2020 that was funded by an American Battlefield Protection Program grant, where we were looking at a battle that occurred after the camp was abandoned around the train depot known as Lawton Station. And some of the metal detecting survey and excavations there produced what looked like a host of structures, probably open structures, probably dealing with metal production, horse care, donkey care, mule care, things of that nature. But some of the stuff that came out of there seems like it could possibly be African American in nature. There's a blue glass bead that we have that's Blue is a significant color in West African traditions, and it's carried over to the enslaved population. There's a little piece of pipe that looks like it might be similar to a pipe that was found at a freed African American settlement in Augusta, Georgia, just literally right up the railroad. That is a figural pipe of Nebuchadnezzar that was produced right after excavations in kind of Babylon, and this kind of archaeological proof of the Bible seemed to have been kind of taken up pretty strongly within African American culture, as with that whole kind of identification between enslaved African Americans and the enslaved Israelites.
That's, I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, if anything good comes out of this, if you're able to tell these stories that have been completely lost and deliberately suppressed at the time, that's, you know, over and above the archaeology you've described so far. That's got to be something that's just so valuable. And yeah, I think we'd love to hear in future an update on this. And I know you do work in blockade runners. Obviously, you know, we are very much complicit in Western Europe in enabling this war to run for as long as it did. But hopefully we'll maybe get you back in future to do that, because I know you've done some really interesting research on that and visiting Glasgow for that as well. But just to finish, I mean, I know you have lots of partners and funders and people that you'd like to thank. So if you could just give us a few words on that, and then we'll wrap up, and just thank you very much, because it's absolutely fascinating. So over to you, Ryan. Thanks again.
Absolutely, yeah. So the Camp Lawton project has really been made possible with a partnership between Georgia Southern University, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who owns the Bogan Fish Hatchery, where the majority of the POW occupation seems to be, and Georgia Department of Natural Resources, that owns the other half of the prisoner stockade, and where the fort and the guard barracks sit on inside Magnolia Springs State Park, and other funders. We managed to get quite a lot of interesting research done on skirmishes associated with Sherman's March to the Sea, and battles around Camp Lawton associated with Sherman's March to the Sea, and that was funded by a National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program grant, generously funded. And yeah, I mean, the rest of the things are the community that's kind of supported a lot of this research, and also I'm thanking the students. I mean, these projects are run as field schools. They're supposed to professionally train our students to go out into archaeology and work in commercial cultural resource management. So it wouldn't have been possible without dozens and dozens of dedicated undergraduate and graduate students who have sweated and, at this point, fought gators, not literally fought gators.
That's absolutely clear. Dr. McNutt has been very good on health and safety, and no one has been attacked or even got very close to an alligator.
Yeah, but no, I mean, this field work is it's made possible by them. They've done, the grad students have done a lot of co-authored research. One of my papers is co-authored with a grad student who did a lot of work and wrote, Emily Jones, and wrote a pretty incredible thesis on health and wellness in Camp Lawton, looking at all these kind of ways to alleviate sickness and illness. Yeah.
Cool. I mean, yeah, I know. That just gives everybody, I think, an insight into how much work goes into an archaeological project, whether by university or commercial. So I think that's hopefully given our listeners a real sort of view of the world we work in. And it just remains for me to say to one of my great friends, thank you so much for your time. And genuinely, I was just listening to it as a fascinated listener, and I hope our listeners enjoy it just as much. So thank you, Dr. Ryan K. McNutt, and we'll give out all the links to all your various websites and the Georgia Southern page on this as well. So thank you very much, Ryan.
Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
Well, I hope you found that as fascinating as we obviously did when we were recording it, and it, you know, being able to tell the story of that enslaved community, Ryan discussing in the second half of the podcast there is very important, and also the work that they're doing in outreach to let people know, and particularly fascinating for me was the work that they're doing on 3D scanning and printing of objects that they're pulling from the ground.
Yeah, so it was an incredible interview, and if you enjoyed that, you might enjoy some of our other podcasts, so make sure you go back through our archives, hit that follow button, hit that subscribe button, wherever you're listening to your podcast. We are available. Please, if you enjoyed it, leave us a review, leave us a rating. That's how other people find out about this podcast. Follow us on our social medias, and if you know anybody who'd enjoy the podcast, maybe send it on to them, share it with them, help us grow so that you can grow, our community can grow together.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.